In the aftermath of the Second World War, tens of millions of people were dead. Across the continent, cities lay in ruins. In places like Hamburg, 500,000 people were left without shelter, surrounded by shattered infrastructure and widespread hunger. The nations that had allied to defeat the Axis powers quickly fractured. The ideological divide pitted the capitalist West, built on private industry and personal freedoms, directly against the communist East, built on state control of land and production. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin openly committed to spreading communism globally. To secure his borders, he began actively installing loyal communist governments and exerting direct control over vast territories across Eastern Europe. The physical destruction of the war had wiped away old political structures. This devastation created a massive power vacuum, turning a desperate, rebuilding continent into an ideological battleground. New international organizations emerged to manage these tensions. The United Nations was formed in late 1945 to foster cooperation, but its mechanisms immediately stalled. The Soviets weaponized their UN veto, blocking any resolution challenging their eastern expansion. With diplomacy paralyzed, the US enacted the Marshall Plan in 1947, pouring economic aid into Western Europe to draw a definitive line of defense. Millions of tons of American supplies physically arrived in Europe to prevent starvation and cut off the social desperation that fueled communist expansion. Stalin viewed this financial support as an aggressive expansion of capitalist influence. He responded by forming Cominform, an organization tasked with directly coordinating communist activities and Soviet directives across 9 European countries. With the UN sidelined, traditional diplomacy had collapsed. What replaced it was a high-stakes economic war that fractured the continent into 2 opposing, heavily fortified blocs. The focal point of this tension rapidly became Germany. While the country was divided among the Allied victors, the capital city of Berlin was split in half, despite sitting deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. In June 1948, the Western Allies introduced the Deutschmark to stabilize the economy in their zones. Stalin reacted aggressively, imposing a total blockade on land and water access to West Berlin, attempting to starve the city into Soviet submission. The US, UK, and France refused to abandon the sector. Instead, they bypassed the ground blockades by launching an airlift through designated flight corridors. Aircraft like the Handley Page Hastings flew day and night for nearly a year. They delivered thousands of tons of coal, food, and medicine, keeping over 2 million West Berliners alive through the winter. The logistical effort was an overwhelming success, forcing the Soviets to lift the blockade in 1949. But the crisis made one thing clear: emergency aid drops were not a sustainable strategy against an aggressive military superpower. Meanwhile, in February 1948, the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia executed a Moscow-backed coup. They seized full control of the government, shattering Western hopes of maintaining democratic buffer states. This expansion forced immediate action. The US, UK, and Canada initiated secret backroom negotiations to replace their fractured diplomatic efforts with a unified transatlantic military alliance. The idea faced severe resistance in Congress, where lawmakers feared being dragged into future European wars. But following his 1948 election victory, President Truman pushed the treaty forward, officially forming NATO in April 1949. The defining feature of this new alliance was Article 5. It established the principle of collective defense, stipulating that an armed attack against one member state would be considered an attack against them all. By signing the treaty, the Western powers drew a definitive military boundary. They shifted their strategy from relying on ad hoc financial aid to establishing a permanent mutual defense pact. To the West, this alliance was a shield. This flag, with its prominent compass design, was used to visually communicate NATO's mission as a peace-seeking organization. But from Moscow's perspective, the treaty was a direct ideological threat designed to challenge Soviet legitimacy. The global balance of power shifted in August 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. This nuclear reality, followed swiftly by the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, forced NATO to evolve. The alliance consolidated its manpower and military resources, creating a centralized command structure in Europe under the leadership of U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower. A diplomatic treaty was no longer sufficient. Driven by escalating global paranoia, The founding members were forced to transform their political agreement into a highly integrated standing military machine. The final provocation occurred in 1955. Despite deep Soviet fears of a resurgent militarized Germany, NATO crossed a major red line and officially admitted West Germany into the alliance. The retaliation was immediate. The Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact, creating their own mutual defense organization to counterbalance Western power and tightly militarize the nations of Eastern Europe. This relentless cycle of action and reaction finalized the divide. The ideological split had now manifested into physical fences and watchtowers, dropping the Iron Curtain across Europe and establishing the brutal rules of engagement that would govern the Cold War for decades.